The frozen dawn. Imagine a morning where the first thing you see isn't your smartphone screen, but your own breath crystallizing in the air. Imagine waking up under 4 layers of heavy wool blankets, yet your nose feels like a piece of ice. There is no thermostat to turn up. There is no hot shower waiting. Outside, the year is 1905, and a great freeze has gripped the land. For the Edwardians, winter wasn't a season for hot cocoa and Netflix. It was a brutal, daily battle for survival. Welcome to the frozen reality of a century ago. The wake-up call. In the early 1900s, the bedroom was often the coldest place in the house. Why? Because coal was expensive. You didn't waste it on a room where you were just sleeping. As the sun barely peeks through the frost-covered window panes, you realize the water in the porcelain pitcher next to your bed has frozen solid overnight. The cold is heavy. It's a physical weight. To get out from under those blankets is an act of bravery. Your floorboards are ice cold, and every step creaks in the silent, freezing air. This is the frozen dawn, the start of the 16-hour workday where your only goal is to stay warm enough to see tomorrow. The first task to fire the house is a tomb until the kitchen range is lit. In an Edwardian home, the range was the heart, the lungs, and the soul of the household. It provided the heat, the hot water, and the cooked food, but it was a demanding master. Before you can even think of warmth, you have to clean out the clinkers, the stony residue of yesterday's coal. Your hands are numb, your fingers stiff. You strike a match, a precious commodity, and nurse the kindling into a flame. It takes an hour for the kitchen to become bearable. Until then, you move like a shadow in the dark, shivering uncontrollably as your body tries to generate its own heat. The psychology of the cold. We often think of people in the past as tougher than us. While they were certainly resilient, the psychological toll was immense. The winter meant isolation. If the snow was deep, no one was coming to help. There was no radio, no telephone for the common farmer. The silence of a 1900s winter was deafening. You were alone with the cracking of the ice and the whistling of the wind through the ill-fitting door frames. Suggested titles for this series: The Great Freeze, 12 Days of Edwardian Survival, Life Before Heaters, How They Didn't Die in 1900, 90 Days of Ice, The Brutal Reality of History. The art of layering. In our modern world, we have smart fabrics, thermal tech, and lightweight down jackets that weigh less than a loaf of bread. But in the winter of 1905, staying warm was a heavy, itchy, and exhausting business. If you didn't dress correctly, the damp cold would seep into your bones, leading to rheumatism or worse, pneumonia, the captain of the men of death. To the Edwardians, clothing was a fashion statement. It was your primary armor against a hostile environment. Let's look at the layers that stood between a human being and a frozen grave. The base layer, the scratchy shield. Long before the morning tea was poured, the struggle began with a union suit or long johns. Unlike the soft cotton blends we wear today, these were made of thick, heavy wool. If you were poor, the wool was coarse and untreated, feeling like sandpaper against your skin. Why wool? Because the Edwardians understood a scientific truth. Wool is a miracle fiber. Even when damp from sweat or melting snow, wool retains its insulating properties. It traps air in its crimped fibers, creating a pocket of warmth generated by your own body heat. But there was a price to pay, the winter itch. For 4 months of the year, your skin was in a constant state of irritation, but that itch was a sign that you were staying alive. The middle layers, trapping the heat. The secret to Edwardian survival was not one thick coat, but many thin layers. Over the long underwear came the flannel shirt, usually made of a wool-cotton blend. For men, a waistcoat vest was mandatory. It wasn't just for style. It provided an extra layer of protection for the vital organs in the chest and abdomen. For women, the layering was even more complex and burdensome. Over the chemise and corset came the petticoat, sometimes 2 or 3 of them. These were made of heavy flannel or quilted fabric. While these layers provided warmth, they added significant weight. Imagine walking through 6 inches of snow while dragging 3 layers of floor-length wool skirts. Every step was a workout, and every workout produced sweat, which was the enemy. If your inner layers got too wet from perspiration, and then you stopped moving, the moisture would turn ice cold, chilling your core instantly. The outer shell, the heavy-duty protection. The greatcoat was the final piece of the puzzle. For a working-class man, this was often the most expensive item he owned. Made of melton wool, a fabric so thick and tightly woven it was almost waterproof. These coats were designed to last a lifetime. They were so heavy that putting one on felt like someone was placing their hands on your shoulders and pushing down. But the coat wasn't enough. In the damp winters of the UK or the North American plains, you needed a barrier against the wind. This is where leather and fur came in for the wealthy, while the poor used heavy wax-treated canvases or simply wrapped themselves in extra woolen shawls. The extremities, the battle for toes and fingers. The most common injury in an Edwardian winter wasn't a cold or flu. It was chilblains. These were painful, itchy swellings on the fingers and toes caused by repeated exposure to cold and then sudden heat. To prevent this, footwear was a priority. Leather boots were greased with tallow, animal fat, or beeswax to make them waterproof. Inside the boots, people would stuff dried hay or old newspapers. It sounds primitive, but paper is an incredible insulator. The air trapped between the sheets of newsprint acted as a thermal barrier, keeping the heat from escaping to the soles of the feet into the frozen ground. Gloves were rarely the thin, stylish things we see in movies. For the laborer, they were thick mittens, often knitted by a mother or wife, with a leather palm stitched on for grip. Mittens were superior to gloves because keeping the fingers together allowed them to share warmth, a small but vital tip for survival. Class warfare, in the cold, the art of layering, also highlighted the brutal class divide of the era. The wealthy had access to silk linings, which reduced the itch of the wool, and luxurious furs like mink or sable that were windproof and incredibly warm. The poor, however, relied on shoddy. Shoddy was a fabric made by grinding up old woolen rags and spinning them into new, low-quality yarn. It was heavy, it smelled when it got wet, and it wasn't nearly as warm as virgin wool. While the rich looked like winter royalty in their velvet and fur, the poor looked like bundles of rags, quite literally wearing layers of history, just to keep their pulse steady. The psychological weight. By the time an Edwardian was fully dressed to go outside, they might be carrying an extra 10 to 15 pounds of clothing. This physical burden contributed to the exhaustion of winter. You didn't just walk, you labored. You didn't just sit, you remained encased in your fabric armor. But as you stepped out the door and the minus 10 degrees Celsius wind hit your face, you thanked every single layer. You were a walking thermos, a self-contained heating unit wrapped in the best technology the 19th century had to offer. The hearth of the home. In the modern world, warmth is invisible. We flick a switch, a silent furnace hums in the basement, and heat flows through vents. But in 1905, warmth was a living, breathing, and hungry beast. It lived in the kitchen, inside a massive, black iron structure known as a range. This wasn't just an appliance. It was a heart of the home. If the fire died, the house died. If the fire grew too wild, the house burned. Managing the hearth was a full-time job that required skill, muscle, and a constant battle against the soot that threatened to choke the lungs of every inhabitant. The black iron beast. The Edwardian kitchen range was a marvel of Victorian engineering and a nightmare of maintenance. Made of heavy cast iron, it stood as a dark monument against the kitchen wall. It featured a firebox in the center, an oven on one side, and a water boiler on the other, for the woman of the house or the servant. The day didn't start with a cup of tea. It started with blacking the range. Every few days, the iron had to be polished with a graphite paste called black lead to prevent it from rusting in the damp winter air. It was back-breaking work that left your hands stained gray for days. But a clean range was a point of pride. It showed that even in the depths of a brutal winter, the household had not given up its standards. The fuel, black gold. In the early 1900s, coal was the lifeblood of the nation. Thousands of men toiled deep underground to provide the black gold that kept the country from freezing. For a typical household, the arrival of the coal man was the most important event of the week. He would carry heavy burlap sacks, weighing over 100 pounds each, down into the cellar. Coal was expensive. A sudden spike in prices during particularly harsh winter could mean the difference between eating meat or eating dry bread. Every lump of coal was counted. You didn't just throw a shovelful on the fire. You placed it strategically. You learned the language of the fire, how to bank it at night, so that a few glowing embers remained in the morning, saving you the struggle of starting from scratch with expensive kindling. The morning ritual of ash. Before a new fire could be lit, the remains of the old one had to be dealt with. This was the ash pit. Cleaning out the ash was the messiest job in the house. Fine, gray dust would rise into the air, settling on the furniture, the food, and into the lungs of whoever was cleaning it. This ash wasn't just waste, though. In the spirit of Edwardian frugality, it was often recycled. Sifted ash was used to soak up spills, mixed with night soil waste for the garden, or even used as a primitive abrasive to clean metal pots. Nothing was wasted because, in the winter, resources were too precious to throw away. The science of heat, the convection struggle. One of the greatest challenges of the 1900s was that heat didn't travel. The kitchen might be a sweltering 25 degrees Celsius, 77 degrees Fahrenheit because of the stove, but just 10 feet away in a hallway, the temperature dropped to near freezing. To combat this, Edwardians used draft excluders, long, snake-like bags filled with sand or sawdust placed at the bottom of doors. They understood that the hot air from the stove would rise and try to escape, while the heavy, cold air from outside would crawl along the floor like a ghost. Life in the winter was a constant movement between zones. You stayed in the kitchen as long as possible. When you had to move to the parlor or the bedroom, you did so quickly, carrying a hot brick wrapped in flannel or a copper bed warmer filled with coals to keep your hands from numbing. The hidden killer, carbon monoxide, with all the doors shut tight and every crack stuffed with rags keep the heat in, a new danger emerged, the silent killer. Coal fires produce carbon monoxide in poorly ventilated houses, or if the chimney flue was blocked by soot or a bird's nest, the gas would build up. Edwardians didn't have digital detectors. They relied on common sense and traditional signs. If the family became unusually drowsy, or if the pet dog seemed lethargic, it was a sign to crack a window, even if it meant letting in the sub-zero air. The choice was often between freezing or suffocation. Many families went to sleep in a warm room and simply never woke up, victims of the very fire that was supposed to keep them safe. The sound of the hearth. There is a specific sound to an Edwardian winter. The rhythmic clink-clink of the coal shovel against the iron grate, the roar of the chimney when the wind caught it, and the occasional pop of a gas pocket in the coal. For the children of the house, The hearth was the center of their universe. It was where they did their homework by the flickering orange light, where they toasted pieces of bread on long forks, and where they listened to their elders tell stories of even worse winters from the past. The fire was more than a utility. It was a member of the family. It required feeding, cleaning, and attention, and in return, it provided the only thing that made the dark, frozen months bearable: light and life. Conclusion of Part 3. But the fire was only half the battle. To keep the fire of the human body burning, you needed calories, and lots of them. In a world where the milk froze in the bottle and the meat turned to stone in the larder, how did the Edwardians feed themselves? Breakfast of survivors. In our modern world, we often count calories to lose weight. In 1905, you counted calories to stay alive, a body living in a house with no central heating, performing manual labor in sub-zero temperatures, burns energy at a terrifying rate. To survive an Edwardian winter, you couldn't rely on a light salad or smoothie. You needed fat. You needed sugar. You needed heavy food that would sit in your stomach like a hot coal. Today, we explore the survival diet, the high-calorie fuel that powered the 12-hour workdays of a frozen century. The frozen larder. Before the sun was even up, the mistress of the house faced her first challenge: the larder. In 1905, there were no electric refrigerators, but in winter, the entire pantry became a freezer. This sounds convenient, but it was a nightmare. The milk didn't just get cold. It expanded as it froze, often pushing the cardboard cap off the bottle or cracking the glass. The butter was as hard as a brick, requiring it to be placed near the stove for 30 minutes before it was even spreadable. Worst of all was the meat. If you had a joint of beef or a ham hanging in the larder, it would be frozen solid. Cutting it required a saw, not a knife. Every meal required hours of pre-thawing near the kitchen range. The Edwardian kitchen was a constant cycle of defrosting, boiling, and stewing. The morning porridge, the foundation. The cornerstone of the Edwardian winter breakfast was porridge, but not the thin, watery version we see today. This was steel-cut oats. Boil for hours until it reached a thick, glue-like consistency. It was seasoned with a pinch of salt and, if you could afford it, a dollop of golden syrup or heavy cream. Oats were the perfect survival food. They are complex carbohydrates that release energy slowly throughout the morning. For a schoolchild walking 3 miles through the snow or a laborer heading to the docks, that bowl of porridge was their internal furnace. It provided a steady stream of heat as the body digested the dense grains. The power of fat, lard and dripping. If porridge was a foundation, fat was a fuel. In the early 20th century, fat wasn't a dirty word. It was a lifesaver. The most common spread wasn't expensive butter, but dripping. This was a cold, congealed fat left over from roasting meat. A thick slice of toasted bread, spread heavily with beef dripping and sprinkled with salt and pepper, was a standard breakfast or snack. To our modern palates, it sounds unappealing, but to a person whose core temperature was dropping, that animal fat was pure gold. It provided the dense calories needed to maintain thermogenesis, the process by which the body generates heat. Without adequate fat intake, the body would begin to shiver uncontrollably within hours of stepping outside, leading to rapid exhaustion. The tea ritual, liquid warmth. No Edwardian morning was complete without tea, but in winter, tea served a dual purpose. Yes, the caffeine provided a much-needed boost for the dark morning, but the primary function was internal heating. The tea was served scalding hot and loaded with sugar. Sugar was a quick-burning fuel, giving the body an immediate spike in energy to tackle the first chores of the day, like shoveling snow or carrying water. The warmth of the cup also served a practical purpose. It was a way to thaw out frozen fingers before putting on work gloves. In many working-class homes, the teapot stayed on the corner of the kitchen range all day long, being topped up with hot water and fresh leaves, acting as a communal station for quick warmth. The struggle for protein. While oats and fats were plenty, fresh protein was a luxury in the dead of winter. Most families relied on salt pork or bacon. This wasn't the thin, crispy bacon we know. It was thick, salt-cured slabs of fat with a streak of lean meat. The salt served 2 purposes. It preserved the meat without the need for ice, and it encouraged the body to retain water, which was strangely helpful in the dry, cold air of winter. Eggs were rare. Chickens often stop laying eggs when the days get short and the temperatures drop. If a family had eggs in January, they were likely water-glassed, an ancient method of preserving eggs by submerging them in a bucket of sodium silicate. These eggs would stay fresh for months, but they were treated like precious jewels, saved for the most grueling days or for the sick. The pudding culture dinner, usually eaten at midday, was the largest meal. This is where the famous suet puddings came into play. Suet is the hard fat found around the kidneys of cows. Edwardans would mix this fat with flour and dried fruits like raisins to create spotted dick or suet dumplings. These puddings were steamed for hours. They were incredibly dense and heavy. A single serving could contain 800 to 1,000 calories. This was a slow burn, fuel that would get a worker through the freezing afternoon until the sun went down. Conclusion of Part 4. The Edwardian winter diet was a masterpiece of survival. It was built on the understanding that the body is an engine, and an engine cannot run without fuel. They ate with a purpose, to stay warm, to stay strong, and to stay alive. But what happens when you finish your meal and realize there is no water left to wash the dishes? Or worse, no water to drink? In our next part, we look at the most basic necessity of life and how it turned into a frozen nightmare. Water and ice. In the 21st century, we take water for granted. We turn a handle, and an endless stream of clean, temperature-controlled water appears. But in the winter of 1905, water was a stubborn, frozen enemy. In the Edwardian era, if you want a glass of water or a pot for tea, you didn't just turn a tap, you often had to fight for it with an axe. Today, we explore the frozen grid. The era where the most basic necessity of life could disappear overnight, trapped inside pipes of lead and wells of stone. The sound of the axe, the morning break. For the millions of people living in rural areas or small villages, water came from an outdoor pump or communal well. On a morning where the temperature had plummeted to minus 15 degrees Celsius, the scene at the village pump was one of communal struggle. The prime of the pump would have frozen solid. To get the water flowing, you had to perform a ritual. First, you brought out a kettle of boiling water, precious water saved from the night before, and poured it slowly over the iron neck of the pump. You waited for the ice to crack and melt within the mechanism. Only then could you begin the heavy, rhythmic pumping, and you had to be fast. If you pumped too slowly, the water would freeze again before it even hit your bucket. The sound of metal clanking and ice shattering was a true alarm clock of the Edwardian countryside. The nightmare of indoor plumbing. In the cities, modern plumbing was beginning to take hold, but it was primitive and ill-prepared for a deep freeze. Pipes were made of lead or cast iron and were often attached to the exterior of houses or buried just inches beneath the cold brickwork. When water freezes, it expands. In the winter of 1905, the sound of a thump followed by a hiss was the sound of catastrophe. A burst pipe didn't just mean no water. It meant that when the thaw finally came, your home would be flooded with freezing, muddy water. To prevent this, Edwardians would leave their taps dripping all night. They knew that moving water is harder to freeze than standing water. However, this led to a secondary problem. The drains would freeze, and by morning, your sink would be a solid block of ice, overflowing onto the floor. The thaw trap. If your pipes did freeze, the methods for thawing them were terrifyingly dangerous. The common solution was to take a flaming rag soaked in oil or a handheld blow lamp and run it along the lead pipes. In a house filled with wooden beams, hay-filled mattresses, and coal dust, this was a recipe for a house fire. Many Edwardian families survived the cold only to lose their homes to a fire started by a desperate attempt to get the water running again. The laundry ordeal. If obtaining water for drinking was hard, obtaining water for cleaning was an Olympian feat. Wash day in the winter was a multi-day battle. You needed gallons of water to wash the heavy woolen layers we discussed in Part 2. This meant hauling dozens of buckets from the pump, heating them on the kitchen range, which took hours, and then scrubbing the clothes by hand. The real heartbreak came when it was time to dry the clothes. You couldn't hang them outside. They would simply freeze into wooden shapes. A shirt hung on a line in 1905, it would become a flat, frozen board in minutes. If you tried to fold it, the fibers would snap. Most families had to hang their wet laundry on closed horses inside the kitchen. This turned the only warm room in the house into a damp, humid, and claustrophobic jungle, with a smell of wet wool and coal smoke mixed into a thick, suffocating air. The harvest of ice. While the average person struggled with ice, for some, the ice was a crop. Before the invention of electric refrigeration, ice was harvested from ponds and rivers. Men with long, jagged saws would venture onto frozen lakes, cutting massive blocks of ice that were 2 feet thick. These blocks were hauled by horse-drawn sleds to ice houses, deep underground pits lined with straw and sawdust. Remarkably, if the blocks were packed tightly enough, the ice would stay frozen all the way through the following summer. In 1905, the ice that froze your pipes in January was the same ice that would cool a wealthy man's drink in July. The ice harvesters were the unsung heroes of the winter, working in the most dangerous conditions, often falling through thin ice just to secure this frozen commodity. Hygiene and the sponge reality. Because water was so difficult to transport and heat, full-body baths were rare in the winter. Most people practiced the sponge bath. You would stand in front of the kitchen fire with a small basin of warm water and a rag, washing one section of your body at a time, while the rest of you shivered in the cold air. This lack of water usage wasn't just about laziness. It was about survival. Every drop of water used for washing was a drop of water that had to be hauled, heated, and paid for in coal. In the hierarchy of winter needs, thirst and warmth always sat higher than cleanliness. Conclusion of Part 5. As the sun began to set at 4 p.m., the struggle for water would pause, but the struggle for work continued. For the Edwardian man, the frozen world wasn't just a home, it was a workplace. Whether you were a farmer, a dock worker, or a postman, the ice didn't mean a snow day. It meant your job just got 10 times harder. Out in the element. In our era, a heavy snowstorm often means a remote work day or a canceled school bus. But in 1905, the world did not stop for the snow. There were no snowplows, no salted roads, and no heated cabins and trucks. If you were a laborer, a farmer, or a postman, the Great Freeze wasn't an excuse to stay inside. It was a challenge that tested the very limits of human endurance. To stay home was to lose your wages, and to lose your wages was to starve. Today, we step outside the home and into the brutal reality of the Edwardian outdoor workspace. The silent streets. The first thing you would notice about a 1900s winter morning was the sound, or rather, the lack of it. Snow acts as a natural acoustic insulator, but the silence was also due to the lack of machinery. The only sounds were the crunch-crunch of heavy boots on packed ice and the rhythmic jingle of horse harnesses. The roads were treacherous. In the cities, the mixture of snow, horse manure, and coal secreted a slippery, black slush known as clutch. Walking through it was an exercise in balance. If you fell, you didn't just get wet. You were covered in the filthy remains of the city's industrial waste. For the street sweepers, their job became a nightmare of moving heavy, frozen piles of the sludge just to keep the main thoroughfares open for the horse-drawn omnibuses. The burden of the horse. In 1905, the world ran on horsepower, literally. Horses were the engines of the economy, and in the winter, they suffered more than the humans. A horse slipping on the ice was a catastrophe. If a horse broke a leg, it was usually a death sentence for the animal and a financial disaster for the owner. To combat the ice, blacksmiths were kept busy day and night fitting frost nails or caulkins to horseshoes. These were sharp metal studs that acted like cleats, digging into the ice to provide grip. But even with these, the effort of pulling a heavy load through the snow was immense. You would see horses with steam rising from their bodies like locomotives, their breath forming thick icicles on their muzzles. The horse watering troughs became frozen blocks, and kind owners would carry buckets of warm mash and ale to keep their animals' internal temperatures up. Farming, the endless chore. For the farmer, winter was not a time of rest. While the crops were dormant, the livestock were in constant danger. Sheep could easily become snowed in, trapped in drifts where they would suffocate or freeze, if not found quickly. Farmers had to trek miles through waist-deep snow, often carrying a long pole to poke into drifts, looking for steam holes created by a buried sheep's breath. Feeding the cattle was a grueling physical labor. Frozen hay had to be pitched, And as we discuss in Part 5, the water supply was a constant battle. The farmer's hands were a map of his struggle. Cracked skin, hacked sores from the cold, and permanent frost-nipped fingertips. There were no waterproof Gore-Tex gloves. There was only grease-soaked wool that eventually froze into the shape of the shovel handle. The postman and the messenger. One of the most respected figures of the Edwardian winter was the postman. In an age before the internet, the mail was the only link between families. The postie was expected to make his rounds regardless of the drifts. Rural postmen often walked 15 to 20 miles a day. In the Great Freeze of the early 1900s, stories emerged of postmen being found leaning against stone walls, frozen to death with their mailbags still gripped tightly. They were the sentinels of communication, and the sight of the red-faced man in his heavy navy blue coat was a symbol of hope for isolated families. They brought the news of the outside world to people who hadn't seen a neighbor in weeks. The danger of whiteouts. Without GPS or paved highways, it was incredibly easy to get lost. A sudden blizzard or whiteout could turn a familiar path into a deadly trap. In the flat plains of North America or the high moors of England, the horizon would disappear. People would lose their sense of direction just yards from their own front door. There are harrowing accounts of Edwardians tying ropes from their back door to the barn so they could find their way back after feeding the animals. If you lost the rope in a whiteout, you were as good as dead. The cold would disorient you, leading to paradoxical undressing, a late-stage hypothermia symptom where the victim feels a false sensation of extreme heat and strips off their clothes, hastening their end. The industrial toil. In the industrial north, the mill girls and iron workers faced a different kind of cold. The factories were massive, unheated brick shells. While the machinery generated some heat, the drafts were lethal. Workers would wrap their feet in burlap sacks and grease their skin with tallow to create a barrier against the freezing dampness. The transition from the scorching heat of a blast furnace to the sub-zero air outside caused shivers so violent they could break teeth. Conclusion of Part 6. By midday, the outdoor worker was exhausted, damp, and hungry. The art of layering we spoke of in Part 2 was now a heavy, wet burden. But as the pale winter sun began to dip toward the horizon, often as early as 3:30 p.m., a new fear set in. It wasn't just the cold anymore. It was the dark. In our next part, we look at the most vulnerable members of the society, the children and the elderly, and how they survived the nights when the mercury dropped to levels that modern thermometers would struggle to measure.